Hey everybody, I know it's been a while since you've seen my face for some of you, so I just wanted to pop on, explain this week's assignment, and let you know of the reemergence of the attendance spreadsheet. So right now they're not asking me for attendance yet, but they want to keep track of who is logging in. So I know like the expectation is not that you need to log in every day like before. Although if you can do that, that would be amazing. Please do that. But if you can, just put your initials when you do sign in. So I have an idea of who has seen my posts, and we have an idea of like who is still actively engaged in emergency remote learning, as they are calling it now. And yes, I am recording this while having my morning coffee and doing laundry because that's how I teach now. All right, so this week we're going to be looking at agreements and organizations that govern international trade. So you've got 5 different options to do a little bit of in-depth of your own research. So every time I give people options, there's at least one person in the class who just does a paragraph on each option. I only want you to choose one of the 5 options to look at in detail. So don't try and tackle them all. That is way too much work. I want you to think sort of critically about one of these issues. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at is just what are some of these organizations. So some of them are trade agreements. So things like what used to be called NAFTA and is now called USMCA. There's no way to pronounce it. USMCA. Which is the agreement that governs trade in North America between Canada, the US, and Mexico. So things like that where you've got a bunch of countries basically agreeing on the rules of trade. And this is really important, and it's more complicated than it seems at first glance. So if you look at an issue like tariffs, probably a lot of you may be looking at that from a consumer perspective. So if you're going to buy a car and you have a Canadian-made car and a Japanese-made car, the Japanese one, probably better, probably cheaper. So why would you ever want to buy a Canadian-made car? So the reason is likely Canada has slapped a tariff on the Japanese car and now they're the same price, or possibly the Canadian car is cheaper. So from a consumer perspective, that absolutely sucks because you're getting something that should be cheaper at a higher price point. But if you look at both the national economy and the actual industry and the people working in that industry, we would never be able to afford cars if we brought in foreign imports at a lower price. And you can see this in a lot of industries where competition has just completely decimated our own ability to produce things and to sell things. I mean, for me, unless I'm shopping at a thrift store, I'm paying way more for my clothes if I don't want something that's made in a sweatshop. So it's really a balance for countries and for companies to look at some of these agreements and in some cases renegotiate these agreements and figure out what's working and what's not, and how much to charge for things and how much to tax things. The other option for this one is to look at some of the trade organizations. And again, these are complicated issues. It's not simple. So when I was about your age or a little bit older, I was going all over the world in what we call summit hopping, protesting organizations like the World Bank and the IMF. And if you look at their websites only, when you're doing your research, you're going to find, well, these guys are helping eliminate poverty, which in some cases is true. And it's particularly vital right now where countries are looking to the IMF for loans. So everybody's going to be in debt after the coronavirus, every country. So these organizations will give loans to countries and sort of keep the economy afloat. And that's, in a lot of cases, a good thing. But it also means it's a loan, it's not a grant. So the countries end up in debt. And part of the conditions of repaying that debt is that they need to change the way they do things. And historically, that's generally meant they are being asked to cut their healthcare, cut their education funding, cut their social safety nets. And so again, these are complex issues where there's opinions on both sides. So one thing that I'm really looking for if you choose option number 1 is to look at some of the critiques of these agreements and organizations. So the next one is about odious debt, and that's along the same lines of what I was just talking about. So the idea of odious debt is not every country is a functioning democracy, as we're seeing right now. And what you do when you have an unelected or otherwise unaccountable leader or government that is accumulating debt, usually to enrich the people at the top. And then who is responsible for paying that back? And we see this in a lot of developing countries where basically they've been governed by an unaccountable government for years and years. And then they're being asked to repay everything that the government has borrowed from organizations like the World Bank or the IMF. And now the citizens are basically stuck for the bill. So they never benefited from these loans, and they never agreed to spend the money the way the money is spent, and now they're having to repay the money. So odious debt is the concept that regular ordinary taxpayers shouldn't have to repay the loans that were and the debts that were accumulated by governments that they didn't vote for. So you're going to look at Greece and whether Greece is an example of that. Option number 3 is looking at the IMF in detail and the concept of structural adjustment programs. So this is that situation where the IMF has loaned money to a country and then use the fact that it's loaning money to the country to decide how that country is going to operate. And that is usually implementing what's called a neoliberal agenda, which is everything gets privatized, schools turn into charter schools, healthcare is for-profit healthcare like we see in the US, welfare is cut, things like that. And this has completely devastated many countries, including Jamaica, which is one of the examples that you can look at, and sub-Saharan Africa. So I want you to look again critically at whether these policies have helped or hurt the countries that receive loans. Number 4 is actually an article written by an old friend of mine that I have found kind of interesting. So last year, Jair Bolsonaro was elected as president of Brazil. And anybody who's following Brazilian politics just tore their hair out because this guy was elected saying he's going to basically torch the Amazon and throw it wide open for developers and murder any indigenous person who stood in his way. And he loves Trump. So right now he's in the news because, again, of the coronavirus, which he likely contracted himself. Definitely some of his ministers did, but he's saying it doesn't exist. So the article was sort of a tongue-in-cheek look at what this would do with Canada's trading relationship with Brazil. And well, this is great because those companies that are torching the Amazon for industry, a lot of them are Canadian companies. We are doing some really horrible things in Brazil. So it's taking a look at Canada and Brazil's trading relationship, which is complicated, especially right now, where we've basically got a trading relationship with a country that, because of its leadership, is imploding. And then the last one is just like, let's look at what's happening after the pandemic. So again, we're going to see a lot of national debt in various countries. And what do we do about it? Does this mean that when we come out of this and we're in debt, we're going to be cutting those social safety nets that we all rely One of the reasons why Canada is not in as bad shape as the US is we have universal healthcare and they don't. So their response, because all of their healthcare is private, they weren't able to help as many people right from the beginning. And not only their economy, but their population has suffered horribly as a result. So there's going to be a lot of pressure coming out of this for governments to cut, so that we're not in debt for, the next few generations. So I want you to take a look at that issue and figure out kind of where do we go from here? How do we structure our economy in a way that's fair, that's humane, but also doesn't leave us with generations of crushing debt? So some really complicated issues. I know I've gone on for a while. So once again, you're going to choose one of these, only one of these, not all 5 of these, and look at it in detail. So just a reminder, I'm available on chat, I'm available on email, and please let me know if you have questions. I'm here all the time. Pretty much I'm logged in like 8-9 hours a day, waiting for people to ask me questions. So please ask me questions. All right, have a great week.